Vítala všechny účastníky pondělního semináře na dálku. And as I have heard, there are also non-native speakers of Czech in the audience, so we will switch to English. I would like to welcome, first of all, our guest speaker, Radek Šimík, from the Faculty of Arts and the Department or Institute of Czech Language. And we are curious to know what relative pronoun morphology reveals about relative clause typology. So the floor is yours, Radek.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to give the talk here in this setting and to share my research with you. Let me share within the chat, let me share the link to the slides that I will be projecting. Of course, it's sufficient to follow the Zoom, but in case somebody wants to download it and backtrack, then feel free to download the slides. So let me just see a nod that everybody sees the slides in Zoom right now. Okay, thank you. So I will speak about what relative pronoun morphology reveals about relative clause typology, and I should say, hopefully also more than just typology, but also syntax and semantics. So let me go. This work is part of a project that I have at the Faculty of Arts. The project, or what I call the mini lab, is called the cross methodological approaches to syntax and semantics. It is part of the Primus funding going between 2019 and 2022. So we're more than 1 year into the project now. And why is it called cross-methodological? The idea is that we are looking at syntax and semantics from various different perspectives, including generative syntax, formal semantics, but also usage-based approaches and the study of corpora. Then also linguistic typology, language acquisition, and we're also planning some experimental work. The current project that we have in this mini lab is from interrogatives to relatives. The basic research questions of this project are: why can interrogative pronouns, also known as WH words, function as relative pronouns? What is the relation between interrogatives and relatives? And how are relative clauses or relative pronouns derived from interrogative clauses or pronouns? The project members are the following, and with them, the different particular goals of the project. Klára Matyasovicová, with her, we study the acquisition of interrogative and relative pronouns and clauses. We do that by looking at the fresh Czech childless corpus, which includes data from a handful of kids. With Adam Pospíšil from the Arabic department, we are looking at interrogative and relative pronouns in Arabic vernaculars. There we are relying on the fieldwork methodology, basically on consulting a handful of native speakers of the individual dialects. With Jakub Slama, we look at Czech relativization strategies, and currently our little sub-project is looking at Czech relative clauses introduced by the word jak. And finally, Hanna Strachoňová looks at interrogative and relative pronouns and clauses in Czech sign language. There has been very little systematic investigation so far, so we're hoping not just for some progress on the theoretical front, but also and perhaps primarily on the empirical front. In this talk, I would like to discuss different kinds of WH constructions, and in particular, the cross-linguistic morphology of relative pronoun across these different kinds of constructions. I will then sketch a so-called nano-syntactic analysis of relative pronouns, kind of briefly and not very technically. And then I will turn to the syntactic and semantic analyses of individual relative constructions and how the relative, what role the relative pronouns play in these different constructions. So I'll start with the constructions and the pronouns that appear in them. In one, we have a WH clause, kde spal, literally where he slept. And I will show how this particular WH clause can be used in very different ways, in very different functions. The first one, illustrated in 2a, is called an interrogative clause, kde spal, with a question mark, where did he sleep? The same kind of form can be used also as an embedded interrogative, which is illustrated in 2b, nevím, kde spal, I don't know where he slept. Another kind of construction that I will be looking at here is the so-called unconditional, or sometimes called unconditional. It's also called concessive conditional sometimes. This kind of construction or clause is illustrated in 3a and 3b. So let's take a look at 3a. Kdekoliv spal, snídal, or tam snídal, meaning wherever he slept, he had breakfast there. And in 3b, ať spal kdekoliv, snídal tam, which is a variant that Czech affords. In terms of the meaning, it's the same. It has different formal syntactic properties that I will not be going into in this talk. In 4, we have yet another kind of construction called the correlative construction. Kde spal, tam snídal. You can see that the correlative is kind of similar to the unconditional. The main difference being that there is, in the correlative, there is no koliv, this postfix koliv, corresponding to the English ever. And of course, there are also some deeper syntactic and semantic differences between these two, and I will be speaking about some of them. Finally, this WH clause, kde spal, where he slept, can be used in Czech at least in the function of what comes closer to standard relative clauses. In 5, there are cases of so-called lightheaded relatives. Those are relative clauses headed by pronominal elements, like the demonstrative tam in 5a, snídal tam, kde spal, he had breakfast there where he slept. This light head tam can also be dropped, and then we get the so-called free relative, snídal, kde spal. And there's also an ever kind of this free relative, snídal, kdekoliv spal. And finally, in 6, there's an illustration of the so-called headed relative, also nominally headed relative. In any case, a relative clause which is headed or which modifies a nominal phrase, like in 6, the phrase room, or the noun room, snídal v pokoji, kde spal. He had breakfast in the room where he slept. Okay, so this is the array of constructions that I'm interested in the project and also in this particular talk. And what we can see is that the interrogative pronoun, and we had the example of kde, where in Czech, can be used in a variety of constructions in Czech. This is in fact representative of most Czech WH words, with some minor exceptions. So here in this little table, we can see an overview with the individual constructions, and we can see that the Czech where, kde, can be used in all of them. what this little plus means in the unconditional row is the ever morpheme, essentially. So it seems attractive to look for a common analysis of WH words in all of these constructions, something that has indeed been attempted to some extent, for example, in the work by Ivano Caponigro, and especially for interrogatives and free relatives. But there is a but, and that is the main but that I will be concentrating on in this talk. Not all languages behave as uniformly as Czech does. Many possess so-called relative morphemes, which are usually affixes which attach to the interrogative base and derive relative pronouns. Here we have, in 7, we have examples from a number of languages. And all of these languages illustrate the same kind of pattern. So in 7a, for example, in Hungarian, the word for who or which is ki in the nominative. And if you want to have a relative who, then you have to add the morpheme a, aki, is the relative who or which. Similarly, in Bulgarian, koi and versus kojto for the relative clauses. In Greek, pios versus opios. In Slovenian, kjer versus kjer. In Spanish, que versus el que. In some languages, the WH morpheme is replaced by a relative morpheme. So it's not that you add some additional morphology to the interrogative base, but you essentially change the very interrogative morpheme, which we call the WH morpheme. An example of this is Hindi, where ko, which can be, when it's used as a relative one, you would get yo. But also from this perspective, a similar view can be held of the German was versus das in headed relative clauses. To have a little more flesh to this initial overview, let me give you examples from one particular language that behaves in the relevant way, which is for our purposes over here, Hungarian. So in interrogatives, the question, who did János introduce to Mary? What you will use there is the interrogative pronoun, obviously, who, which is kit for accusative. If you look at unconditionals, which is the other kind of construction we're interested in, you will see that you also use the interrogative WH word, ki, and you, just like in Czech or in English, you complement it by the ever morpheme, which in Hungarian happens to be akar. So you get akarki, as illustrated in 10. In correlatives, you can get, to some very limited extent, you can get the interrogative word, which is illustrated in 11a. This happens productively in proverbs. Here we have who digs a pit for someone else, falls in it himself. And there you have the option between the interrogative ki and the relative aki. If you look at correlatives which don't have a proverbial interpretation, then you necessarily use the relative morpheme. So you cannot use ki alone, you have to use aki. Okay, which is illustrated in 11b. Now let's move on and get to free relatives, which are illustrated in 12. I invited whoever I saw, or I invited who I saw. And here we can see that we absolutely have to use the relative form of the WH word. So not just kit, it has to be akit. And even if you try to use the WH word together with the ever morpheme, which is the akarki, you cannot do so if this is in use in the free relative. you have to use a different way to derive the ever-free relative. You don't use akar, the bound morpheme, but you have to use čak, which happens to be only, but has a different interpretation in this case. So you have akit čak. In headed relatives, finally, you also have to have the a morpheme on the WH word, okay? And you absolutely cannot have the, or you cannot have just the key. So here's a brief summary for Czech and Hungarian. We can see that not all languages can use interrogative pronouns across all the WH constructions considered. Hungarian only uses the interrogative form systematically in interrogatives or embedded interrogatives, which I didn't illustrate, but they use them there as well. And in unconditionals and in proverbial correlatives, but correlatives, free relatives, and headed relatives must involve a specialized relative form, which is derived from the interrogative base. This is illustrated in the table. Okay, and now if we extend the cross-linguistic picture, and obviously I'm not going to go through all the individual languages over here, so you have to trust me on the data being fine. And of course, if you look deeper into the languages, you discover various different complications, but the overall picture looks, and I'm pretty confident about that, as we see in this table. So what we have, what we can see here is that the constructions that I discussed, interrogatives, unconditionals, correlatives, free relatives, and relatives, or headed relatives, they form a certain hierarchy, with the first one, the interrogatives, being the most basic one, and with the headed relatives being the most complex one, if you wish. And we can see that on this hierarchy from interrogatives to headed relatives, different languages, and in fact different WH words, individual WH words, choose a different cutoff point where they mark that something else than interrogative is going on. Czech and English is also an example of that, is kind of the most boring language, if you wish. You can see that Czech uses the same WH word across the board, across all the constructions. German does the switch at the level of headed relatives, where it cannot use in headed relatives the standardly WH words, but has to use words that correspond to demonstratives. Turkish is here an example of a language which can use WH words, the interrogative forms, until the level of the correlatives, and then it cannot use actually anything from there. Hungarian, as we saw, does the switch around the level of correlatives. Bulgarian does the switch around the level of unconditionals, just as Hindi does, or unconditionals or correlatives. There's some level of optionality going on, probably associated with different kinds of interpretations. And the final kind of language is Greek, which does the switch already from interrogatives to unconditionals, where already in unconditionals you have to have a different kind of form. And Greek shows us actually two cutoff points, where it also does yet another morphological move at the level of headed relatives. So headed relatives, the headed relative pronoun is not just opios, but it's in fact opios, even preceded by another element that looks like a demonstrative or definite article. Okay. The extreme kind of case, very recently documented and described for these purposes by Ivano Caponigro and Peter Arkadiev, is the Caucasian language Abaza, which doesn't have WH words at all. It doesn't have even interrogative WH words. The way it does, it creates interrogatives and all other kinds of constructions involved here at least to the extent they're documented, is that it uses sort of the relative clause strategy for all of these. Anyways, what we see is this implicational universal over here, saying roughly the following: if a relative morpheme surfaces on a pronoun in some construction in the hierarchy in 14, it also surfaces on that pronoun in all constructions lower on that hierarchy, provided a relative pronoun can be used at all. Here is yet another example of a similar phenomenon. This is from our very recent fieldwork done on Syrian Arabic. And we can see that, well, what this illustrates primarily is that we cannot look at a language at a time, but we really have to look at, so this different behavior is a property not of the whole language, but of individual WH words. And you can see that in Syrian Arabic, the word for what, shu, can be used all the way to free relatives, and in headed relatives, a different kind of construction has to be used, which happens to be a relative clause introduced by complementizer-like element, something like the English that, and combined with a resumptive strategy, where there is a resumptive pronoun referring back to the nominal head. Who does this switch from the WH strategy to the complementizer strategy, from the level of correlatives to free relatives, and similarly so in where. In where there is another interesting phenomenon that we can observe. The interrogative form then can be used for interrogatives, unconditionals, and correlatives. And when you get to free relatives and headed relatives, you start using a different kind of relative pronoun. The relative pronoun happens to have its source in the word for place in Syrian Arabic, that's mahal. And it combines with the ma suffix or postfix, which in Syrian Arabic and in Arabic in general is actually pretty polysemous and multifunctional. So this is a complicated element that we have to study deeper. You can see in the unconditional line that it can be used as the ever morpheme and is productively used so, but it can also have the meaning or the function of a relativizing morpheme alone. Okay. And finally, in the final column, we can see that for when the switch is already being done from the level from unconditionals to correlatives, where there is a similar kind of suppletion going on as with where the WH word aimat is being replaced by the word for time, lam, combined with ma. Okay, so this is another example of the same kind of hierarchy being applied to Syrian Arabic and the WH words of this language. I will walk you through very briefly and sort of informally through a nanosyntactic analysis of this kind of phenomenon, of this kind of cross-linguistic view of relative pronouns. The idea here is that relative pronoun or interrogative pronouns or pronouns in general, or in fact any kind of word, corresponds to not just a terminal symbol in a tree, in the syntactic tree, but it actually corresponds to a whole phrase. So words or morphemes can spell out, can lexicalize, not just single elements, not just heads, syntactic heads, but actually full phrases. So what you see in the little tree at the bottom of the page is a representation of a relative pronoun, just of the word, not of the relative clause. The NP at the bottom of the structure stands for the nominal restrictor. So if you look at English where, for example, then this NP would stand for the part, expressing place. And the WH would be the spell out of the rest. And the idea is that the syntactic structure sort of grows as with the different functions that we were looking at. So the FOC-P, the focus P, corresponds to the interrogative pronoun and is also used for unconditionals. The topic P, or I have this little R subscript, which means relative. So it's like a relative topic phrase, and above the relative force phrase. So the topic P corresponds to the correlative pronoun, and finally, the force P corresponds to relative pronouns used in free or headed relatives. So you can see the structure, the syntactic structure grows, and that's also what you see reflected in the morphology, where the morphology also grows with the functions as the functions differ. Okay. So if we look at the individual, and here's just, of course, an example, a subset of the individual cases that we were looking at, the idea is that a language like Czech has the lexical representation, the syntactic part of the lexical representation of the word for where, kde in Czech, will correspond to the whole force P, to the whole relative pronoun. And the idea in nanosyntax is that you can actually use this lexical representation to lexicalize any subset of this. So in case you use the WH word only in an interrogative, then you actually in the syntax only create the focus P. But because the focus P is a subset of the lexical representation of the word for kde, where, you can actually use this lexical entry and lexicalize the focus P by this word kde. And there's a number of principles that are observed in this kind of nanosyntactic analysis, which, if you want to know more about, you should take a look at Michal Starka's work, or in Czechia, Pavel Caha's work. Pavel Caha is in Brno, is a proponent of this kind of approach. So let's take a look at Hindi. And there in Hindi, we can see that the K words, in this case, kidhar, correspond, or that means where in Hindi, and is only used in interrogatives. And if you want to use this word in a relative clause, you have to use a bigger representation, either top P in the correlatives or force P in headed relatives. And there you already have to use a different word, because the lexical namely yidhar, because the lexical entry for kidhar corresponds to the focus P, and therefore top P is not a subset of that. So top P would be a subset of yidhar. So you would have to use yidhar already. Let me show you a slightly less formal picture of this. Here you can see the heads, the individual syntactic heads, focus, topic, and force in a horizontal fashion. And you can see that the functional field of the Czech where, kde, sort of spans over all these three. Whereas in Hindi, kidhar only corresponds to the first one. It can only function as the interrogative pronoun. And the yidhar would be used for relative clauses. You can see that yidhar, we assume that it spans over the whole functional field. And the reason why kidhar is used and not yidhar for the interrogative purpose is that kidhar is more specific for that. So there's a specificity principle observed. So if you have a specific lexical item just for one function, you will use that. For the Syrian case, we can see that ven is used for the interrogatives and correlatives. But once you get to the level of free or headed relatives, you have two phenomena going on. You have to use the morpheme, and there is suppletion in the root. So you no longer can use ven, but you have to use mahal. Okay, so there's two kinds of phenomena going on. And finally, the Bulgarian koj is just the spell out of the interrogative pronoun. And if you want to use the pronoun in a correlative or a relative function, you have to use this additional postfix to. Okay, so both of these are spelled out, kojto, as a result. Okay, so I realize that this is probably not enough for you to understand fully the idea of how relative pronouns and interrogative pronouns can be represented in a non-syntactic framework, but I hope that it gives you a taste of it at least. But not much of what follows hinges on this. Let me, before I get to the syntax and semantics, let me dwell a little on the hierarchy that we observed for the purposes of morphology, and show you that it's relevant more generally, not just for morphology. So one generalization that seems to hold is the following. It's listed over here. If a language can use a WH pronoun for a construction X, it can use it for any construction to the left of X, essentially. So languages with WH pronouns that use WH pronouns in all the constructions, that is the case of most European languages. Languages that do not have WH pronouns or relative pronouns for headed relatives include Mesoamerican languages and Arabic vernaculars mostly. Languages without WH-based pronouns for free relatives and headed relatives for these two, so that those that only have them for the first three, include Turkish or Chinese, and languages that do not even have correlatives, that only have WH pronouns for interrogatives and possibly unconditionals. Those are actually most languages of the world. Okay. Another kind of generalization where this hierarchy is applicable is the position of WH words in the individual constructions. So what we can observe, and I will return to it, is that WH in situ, in free relatives or in headed relatives in these two final constructions, is extremely rare. So you know that WH words in interrogatives can be used, and there are many languages where they can be used in their argument positions. So essentially a question like, what did you cook, would be asked as you cooked what? And this would be a normal question. This is what roughly 2/3 of the world's languages do. But it seems and it appears that you never have a free relative or a headed relative with a WH pronoun in situ. So while you have a lot of languages that do something like, I saw the table which you showed me, you will never have, I saw the table you showed me which. This is not attested. And the only potential counterexample that I've found out of roughly 60 languages is Hittite, which is an old and unfortunately dead Indo-European language. It's hard to experiment with. Diachrony is another domain where this hierarchy is useful, it appears, because it seems that while the most languages, the absolute majority of languages in the world, have WH words for interrogatives and quite a few for unconditionals, it appears that in order to get to the free relative or headed relative function of WH words, you usually go through the correlative function. There's diachronic work for this. So you can see that this hierarchy is not relevant just for morphology, but also for other domains of grammar. So I'm now turning to the second part of the talk, where I will show you how we can make sense of, make syntactic and semantic sense of the hierarchy. Let us start with the core meaning, with interrogatives. The idea is that interrogative pronouns denote restricted variables. So something like what the denotation of that will be a variable x, but it's a restricted variable, so it has to be an x that is a thing. For where, this would be an x that is a place. For when, it would be an x that is a time. Interrogatives then, I mean interrogative clauses, denote open propositions. So in 16a, we have an example of that. What is beeping? Question. And the idea is that this would denote an open proposition of the form X is beeping and X is a thing. This is in fact a kind of analysis that is not usually assumed, and it's also not terribly crucial for my purposes over here. It's just simpler to talk about it, but let me show you in 16b what is the more standard view. So in 16b, what is beeping will be represented not as an open proposition, but in fact as a set of propositions. So here we have a set of propositions of the form X is beeping and X is a thing. And the set will be composed of elements, of propositions, which have different values for the X variable. So the values will be selected from a domain, from some contextual domain. Okay. And then answers to WH questions provide a value for the variable X. And in the propositional account of WH questions, an answer will be one of the possible, one of the set of propositions denoted by that question. So an example here is in 17, the oven is beeping. The meaning of that is the proposition that the oven, represented here by the iota expression, the oven is beeping, and that is a member of this set. Okay. Or in other words, the oven is one possible value for the X variable. So this is the core meaning of interrogatives, and we will start from here and go on, and I will show you how this core meaning is further manipulated in order to create the more complex meanings of correlatives and relatives. I will stop for a moment with unconditionals, and I will show you that essentially the meaning of interrogatives can be used almost as in a direct fashion for unconditionals as well. So in 18, we have two examples of unconditionals. 18a, whatever is beeping, it's annoying. 18b, whatever is beeping, I can't stay here. And you can see these two differ in whether the WH word is being picked up referentially in the consequent. Either it is, there is an it, or it is not. Okay, whatever is beeping, I can't stay here. This is something that is possible for unconditionals. In general, across languages, you don't have to pick up referentially the WH word or the referent introduced by the WH word. The analysis, the standard analysis of unconditionals is illustrated in 19 for these two examples. The idea is that it doesn't matter which value you take. So for all the possible values of the thing that is beeping, the consequent holds, right? So for all the possible values of the thing beeping, the thing beeping is annoying. Okay, this is the first part. Or for all possible values of the thing beeping, I can't stay here. Okay, so if the oven is beeping, I can't stay here. If the washing machine is beeping, I can't stay here, and so on. So the consequent in this latter case is the same for all the conditionals in the set. Now, conditionals in formal semantics are typically treated not in terms of the material conditional that we have right, not in the simple Boolean approach to conditionals, but rather in terms of quantification over possible worlds or situations. We have that in a simplified form in 20. So the idea there, if we are looking just at the conditional, which is represented over here, the idea is that a conditional like if X is beeping, then X is annoying, is represented as for all possible worlds that are accessible from some evaluation world, W0, and such worlds where X is beeping, it holds that in these possible worlds, that thing that is beeping is annoying. Okay, so this is this might seem as an innocent reformulation of the basic analysis of conditionals, but it has been shown to have important consequences for the analysis of natural language conditionals. Let me now walk you very briefly through an aside on WH-based indefinites. So what we have been looking at were WH-based relative pronouns, but there's also a phenomenon, a much better studied and understood phenomenon of WH-based indefinites. Examples of these kinds of indefinites are given in the table. And of course, we have good illustrations also in English, where, somewhere, everywhere, anywhere, nowhere, and so on. And similar phenomenon can be observed in other languages too. The idea, quite a popular idea, kind of popular analysis of this kind of phenomenon, is that what the affix that turns a WH word into an indefinite, what it does is that it indicates how the variable that the WH word denotes should be bound. Okay. So if we have somewhere in a sentence, then the where denotes the variable. That's the meaning that it also has in the interrogative clause. And the some expression doesn't necessarily have a meaning of itself. It just indicates that there is an existential quantifier somewhere in the clause above it, or in the sentence above it, that binds the variable. Okay, and the same for everywhere, that would be the universal quantifier. For nowhere, it would be a negated existential quantifier. The binders are typically drawn from standard logical operators, as you can see over here. Now, let's use this this basic analysis of indefinites on maybe one step back. We already saw that this same kind of analysis here is being used for the ever morpheme. So in whatever, it's kind of an indefinite pronoun, where the ever indicates a relation to a higher universal operator. Okay. It's a very wide scoping universal operator that scopes over the whole conditional, in fact, not just over the antecedent. Okay, so correlatives. Let's now move to correlatives. Correlatives are a bit like unconditionals, but they have a few important differences. They have no ever morpheme. They exhibit an obligatory anaphoric pickup of the WH pronoun. And there is also a tendency towards habitual interpretations, cross-linguistically. So 22a is giving you an example of correlative in Czech. Co pípa, to rozbiju. What beeps, that I will destroy. I will destroy whatever beeps or what beeps. Okay, that's the meaning of the sentence. You can see that there is a couple between co and to. Okay, this is a characteristic property of correlatives. And in fact, it is an obligatory property of correlatives, and that is illustrated in 22b. Co pípa, nemůžu tady zůstat is not a grammatical sentence in Czech. What beeps, I can't stay here is not fine in Czech. The intended interpretation, of course, is kind of the unconditional interpretation, but the unconditional interpretation is not possible without the ever morpheme. Now, I propose to model correlatives as conditionals of sorts, where the Kratzerian conditional universal quantifier binds not only worlds, but also correlative pronouns. So the representation of what beeps that I will destroy will be as in 23, which if I translate for you to a semi-formal English, that would be for all the worlds and entities X, such that the worlds are accessible, and the X is a beeping thing in those worlds, it holds that the speaker will destroy that thing in those worlds. So this meaning corresponds to our intuitions of, or these truth conditions correspond to our intuitions of what this means. Now, how does this hang together with the morphological picture that I've been giving? Well, just like indefinites, like somewhere, indicate how the variable introduced by where should be bound, namely by the existential quantifier. The idea here is that the relative morpheme, so for example, in Bulgarian, in kojto, the to, how this morpheme indicates that it wants to be bound by the conditional / correlative universal operator. Okay, so these truth conditions are very similar to what I just described for Czech, just with different lexical words, and the analysis is the same. So the idea that the WH word, the correlative operator, is being bound by the conditional operator over here. Okay, so that's, I'm using the color coding for that. Now, there is an interesting empirical corroboration of this kind of analysis, because some languages, and Bulgarian is an example of that, they, when you look at multiple WH correlatives, Bulgarian exhibits optionality with respect to whether the relative morpheme to appears either on both WH words, as we can see in 27a, or just on one of the WH words, as we can see in 27b. And there is an important difference in interpretation that is predicted by the present analysis. In 27a, where the to appears on both WH words, in our analysis, this means that both of these entities denoted by the WH words have to be bound by the conditional correlative operator. And the result is that the sentence is telling us something about a single pair of a person and something that hurts the person. So the sentence means the person who has something hurting talks about it. If you place the relative morpheme only on one of the WH words, then only one of them is bound by the conditional correlative operator, which is over here. So here it's only the Y, only the thing that hurts, and the word for kogo, who, does not have that. So that is being bound by the high universal operator, as in unconditionals, and this gives us the so-called pair list reading. So everyone talks about whatever is hurting them. Okay, this is the reading, and this is predicted by the present analysis. I know it's probably too quick for you, but I'm happy to talk about it later if you wish. Now let's get to the final type of construction, free relatives or headed relatives. What's going on there? An example is given in 28 of a lightheaded relative / free relative for Czech, s ním, co uvaříš, I'll eat what you cook, or s ním to, co uvaříš, I'll eat that what you cook, that which you cook. What we can see here is again sort of there is the interrogative base being present in the semantic analysis of this, and importantly the entity, the WH variable, the X, is now here being bound not by a universal operator as we saw it in unconditionals and then in a different form for correlatives, but is being bound by a determiner, in this particular example by an iota operator, so by something that corresponds to a definite determiner. We can again build on the basic assumption that relative morphology indicates a relation to an operator. This time the operator is not a universal one, but it's a quantificational determiner, such as the definiteness related iota operator. So here is again is an example from Bulgarian. Vzemi kakvoto iskaš, take what you want. The what is not merely what, but is what and a relative morpheme. And in this case, the relative morpheme indicates a relation to a determiner, which in the semantic analysis corresponds here to the iota operator. Of course, there is a tight relationship, formal and semantic as well, between correlatives and free relatives and lightheaded relatives. An example of that is given in 32. 32a gives you a correlative, co uvaříš, to s ním, what you cook, that I will eat. And you can sort of just reverse the order of these elements and you get a lightheaded relative or a free relative. S ním, to, co uvaříš. Okay. And this can be approached by the so-called E-type approach to donkey anaphoric pronouns, of which pronouns in consequence of conditionals are an example. So essentially, this could be the logical form of these examples, where the first bracketed structure, what you cook, is corresponds to the correlative. And then we'll have in the consequent, I'll eat that, and the same material from the correlative can be sort of reused in the lightheaded relative. Okay, so here this is sort of this is the kind of switch that languages can do from correlatives to free relatives or to lightheaded relatives, and this has been documented diachronically too. Now, there is an important difference between correlatives and free relatives, and that is the position of WH words, cross-linguistically speaking. So we have this generalization that I already hinted at, that relative pronouns in free, lightheaded, and restrictive-headed relatives must not be in situ. An example of this is Hindi. I have an example of that. So Hindi is primarily a correlativizing language. So it uses correlatives, and in correlatives, the WH word or the relative pronoun, and so that's already the yes pronoun, can be in situ. It can be in the argumental position. It doesn't have to move to the clause initial position. But when you use these relative clauses, not as correlatives, but restrictive relatives, then you can see that you have to have the WH word in the initial position. This is in 34b, you see an example with a WH in situ for the relative pronoun, which is reported not to be okay by Rajesh Bhatt. Right, but this would be a fine correlative clause, okay? That's the point. So WH movement is necessary in relative clauses as opposed to correlative clauses. And the reason why WH ex situ is obligatory in relatives is that the licensing operator, the determiner, does not require a proposition as its argument, as for example, conditional operators or correlative operators do in correlatives or conditionals, but rather a property. And the relative pronoun movement is instrumental in deriving this property, namely by the process of lambda abstraction. So if we have a pseudo English sentence, you cook what, like this would be in Hindi, you cook what, or you what cook, then this could be a question. This could also be a correlative. But if you want to use this WH clause as a free relative, which is selected by a determiner, which in turn requires a property, you have to perform WH movement in order to lambda abstract over the variable and thus create a property of being the things that you cooked, rather than just being the proposition of you cooking something. Okay, and then this property can become the argument of the determiner, giving us then the final, the resulting meaning, the thing that you cooked. Okay. Let me summarize. I showed that the family of correlative pronouns can be analytically assimilated to indefinite pronouns, provided that we assume that the common syntactic and semantic denominator of indefinite or relative morphology is the indication of a relation to a quantificational operator. With indefinite pronouns, the indefinite affixes indicate a relation to some logical operators that bind the variable introduced by the WH word. In correlative pronouns, the affix on correlative pronouns indicates a relation to a conditional operator or specialized conditional correlative operator, which I call here, or just which I note here as if cor. And finally, relative pronouns, the relative affixes indicate a relation to a determiner, to a quantificational determiner. And they entail, and here the movement of the WH pronoun, of the relative pronoun, is being forced for semantic reasons in order for the WH clause to be selectable by the determiner. The conclusion, I showed that interrogative forms are basic. Relative pronouns are derived from interrogative ones. Sometimes this derivation is not being made visible by the morphology of a language. Different languages make different cutoff points within the paradigm of the individual constructions. I showed how this paradigm, morphologically speaking, can be analyzed by nanosyntactic instruments. Then I proposed a syntactic and semantic analysis of these individual constructions, which makes sense of this kind of picture, where we saw that that semantically speaking, interrogatives are the most basic structures, and the further construction, sort of the deeper you get, the more complexity you're adding to the basic interrogative pronominal semantics, and also to the interrogative clause semantics. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your very detailed and interesting analysis. I hope